we are just done with the post-Mauryan period, right? So everything we have finished like regarding the post-Mauryan period, and towards the end we had started discussing about basically the Sangam age, and in the last class we covered the Sangam age, and there we tried to discuss about every possible aspect such as the polity of their, right, then economy, then society, right, everything we have discussed. So of course you can see that from Sangam age there are a couple of questions which are being asked, right? So like anything which is there on Sangam age that you can find, the content is there, and as I have already promised you that I'll give a like notes on Sangam age, because megalithic abhi. Okay, fine. So megalithic and Sangam, that I'll like forward to you, and that would be the final material. Okay, so since I did not dictate it, and that's the reason I'll be providing you the notes. Okay, the notes will be in the same format, the dictated format only, right? So like now we are going to start with a new age that's called as the Gupta age, right? And as you all know that this is the, now formally this is considered to be the last part of ancient India, right? This is considered as the last chapter of ancient India, and that's how like it remains very important. So at one hand we can say okay, this is the last age or important period for the ancient India, that is one thing, right? The next thing that we have to keep in mind whenever it comes to question, so far like so far lesser dimensions have been asked on Gupta period. Lesser dimensions are asked, right? But I'm categorically telling you that there is greater scope, of questions. Now this you have to keep in mind very like carefully, that so far you can find that there are very lesser dimensions on what UPSC has asked question. But then when I read this particular chapter, when I try to comprehend this particular chapter, like as I'm telling you that there are greater scope of the questions, like and so far they are not being hunted. And that's how when it comes to Gupta period, we have to be very careful while understanding the Gupta period, right? So now when it comes to Gupta period, there are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind first, that let's say if this is the Gupta period or this is Gupta age, what are the important dimensions like that we need to know for the Gupta period. So do you know one thing, whenever it comes to Gupta age, now this particular age remains very significant for historiographical debates. Historiographical debates. This is one age of ancient Indian history which remains highly controversial or highly debatable among the scholars, and there are a couple of reasons because of what this is there, like that I'll try to discuss of course in this particular class. So it remains like highly historiographical, it remains important for this historiographical debate. That is one important aspect which like we should know. Now the second important thing like that we need to know for the Gupta age is basically there are certain terms which are associated with it, such as one, that it is being called as golden age of Indian history. Now whether to what extent it is correct to call it golden age or not, that we'll try to like evaluate. The second, it is even being called as the classical age of Indian history. It's being called as the classical age of Indian history. That remains another important dimension. Apart from that, okay, what else that you need to remember, like since I have already told you that since it was the last kingdom, and that's how like one aspect which remains very important here, that is about the nature of state. What was the nature of Gupta state? Because it remains very different from the previous kingdoms. Now it is though considered as an empire, but yet there are so many questions which are raised for the nature of state, and whenever it comes to the comparison of Gupta empire and the Mauryan empire, there are so many differences like that had been noticed by the scholars, and that's how the nature of Gupta state like that remains very important, though it is considered different from the previous empires, and that's how the nature of state like that's very important. Sometimes you do find questions on something that's called as administration also, right? So since Gupta empire remains different in nature, and this is the reason because of what the questions are being asked from this, on this part also, that what kind of administration it had, whether it was like the same detailed administration what we have seen with the Mauryans, or it's very different. That remains one important area for the question. what next, like, which is important here. Now, there's another very important debate, like, that we find. This is pertaining to basically the Gupta economy. Now, this is a very important dimension, like, from where you can find the questions. So, the way I told you, the nature of state remains very different. In the same way, the Gupta economy remains very different. Why the Gupta economy remains very different? Because it is normally assumed by the Marxist scholars that economy was getting down. On the other hand, when it comes to the nationalist scholars, they have imagined that actually this was the most flourished economy, or this was the age when you can find the most flourished economy. This is the reason because of what the economy remains very important. Okay. Apart from this, there is something which again plays very important role, like in your syllabus, and that is about the Gupta society. Now, society is again very important. Why? Because, like, there are several changes that could be noticed in society during this particular period, and in fact there are multiple reasons because of what we talk about the consolidation of the Hindu society during this period, and that society, that consolidation of the society could be understood with respect to various other things. But here I am just writing you one thing, like when you talk about the society, you can talk about consolidation of Hinduism. When you talk about society, you can talk about the proliferation of Varna, and like most importantly the caste system. So this is how the society in this particular period is taking a concrete shape, and probably, like, the society which was built during the Gupta period, it was the same society with some minor changes continued till date, and this is how it remains very important. So Gupta society I always find very important with respect to the UPSC questions, right? Well, apart from the society, we can hunt one more area, and that area remains again very important, and this area is pertaining to the art and culture. Right. Since in this particular period you find great amount of, like, development in art and culture, and in fact there are various forms of art which are growing, which are developing in this particular period. Rather, like suppose you talk about architecture, suppose you talk about the sculptures, let's, like, talk about the music and dance as well. So in every area you can find, like, the development is there. There is one more area with respect to this art and culture which flourished a lot during the Gupta age, that is basically the Sanskrit literature. So Sanskrit, it is considered to be one of the golden periods for the Sanskrit literature, and this is the reason because of what art and culture remains very significant in this particular period. And then finally I can say one more thing, and that's about the religious development during this particular period. That remains, like, again very important, because I have already discussed some of the things with respect to the consolidation of Brahmanism, but frankly speaking it is not only known for the consolidation of Brahmanism, but also it is known for basically, like, the certain changes in Buddhism, certain changes in Jainism, and apart from that there were so many minor sects and the cults which were emerging during this particular period, and that's how, like, it remains a religious development remain very important during this particular period, right? So as, like, this particular age is known for multiple important changes, and probably this is the reason because of what it remains one of the most important topic for basically the historiographical debates. Like, that's why I have just written it earlier, like, or in the beginning, that historiographical debate is very important for the Gupta age. Right. Okay. Yes, it is one of the debates, like, that is regarding the feudalism. So we'll address that also, right? So these are various dimensions on what you can expect the questions from the Gupta age, right? And that's how this is a very important topic. But this is so unfortunate that so far good number of questions have not been asked in UPSC. But then here I am showing you the possibilities of the question, and that's how you should be ready. And in fact, I am telling you that in coming few years, you can definitely see the increasing number of questions from the Gupta age, and that's why be ready for the questions as far as this Gupta age is concerned. Fine. So now, when it comes to Gupta age, I would like to start with the first concept, and that concept is what? This concept is basically the historiographical debate pertaining to Gupta age. Historiographical debate for Gupta age. Let me tell you categorically, when it comes to the Gupta age, there are many debates which are for the Gupta age, right? But one by one we'll be discussing about, like, all of them. So the first debate what I'm going to pick up here, that is basically that famous debate is about that golden age, that famous discussion regarding this golden age. So first we need to understand ki how come this particular concept even appears that Gupta age was the golden age. So normally you can talk about the moment it is, and in fact this is one mistake that you mostly commit in your answer writing. Like suppose there is a question that has been asked on the golden age. In that case you'll just come up with what? The various evidences or the various reasons because of what, like it's being called as golden age. But then it is a wrong approach. You know, when any particular period is called as golden age, so I hope you can understand that somebody must have called it golden age. Well, there must be a particular historian who has called it golden age. So if someone is calling any particular period as golden age, you have to understand one point, there must be some idea behind it, some reason behind it, because of what somebody was willing to call it golden age, and the same is true for the Gupta age also. So basically we can say that this is a historical bias, or this is a bias of historians because of what it is being called as the golden age. So yes, it is being called as golden age by some of the historians, right? And I hope you all can understand ki what sort of historians must have preferred to call it golden age. Like basically they are the nationalist scholars, right? They all have preferred to call it the golden age, right? So why they have preferred to call it golden age? Why? Because there was a concept of something that is called as dark age. That is called as dark age, right? So since there are certain periods of Indian history that have been called as dark age by couple of scholars, and specifically that concept of dark age was brought in India by which scholars? By the colonial scholars, right? So since the colonial scholars have desperately called certain period as dark age, and that's why Indian scholars were very much willing to call certain periods as golden age. And in fact, how come this idea appeared for the Gupta age? Again, there is a very simple reason. Whenever it comes to the post-Mauryan period, right, the post-Mauryan period, that has been termed as the dark age of Indian history, correct? Now it's not necessary that the post-Mauryan period has been called as dark age and this is the only period which has been called as dark age. Rather, I can say there were multiple periods of Indian history which have been called as dark age. So you need to understand from where exactly this concept of dark age is coming. So undoubtedly this is an European concept, right? In Europe you can find that there is one period immediately before the Renaissance or Enlightenment which is called as dark age. And why it's being called as dark age, there was a couple of reasons because of what European scholars have thought of calling this period as dark age. And when these European scholars have started coming to India and they started writing about India, now they picked up certain period of Indian history as well and they started calling it dark age. And frankly speaking, majority of the European scholars have called 18th century as dark age. 18th century, and there was a very clear-cut reason because of what they all had been thinking of calling 18th century as dark age, because they needed to justify their rule. This transformation was going on in India. India was now being colonized. Since India is being colonized, and before that Indian rulers had been ruling, and that's why they were looking for certain reasons that they could validate their rule, they could justify it, and that's why they have started calling 18th century as dark age. But once they call 18th century as dark age, certain parameters were fixed, and on the basis of the parameters, there were some other periods of Indian history, they were also called as dark age, and among them we can talk about one period is undoubtedly the post-Mauryan period, that's called as dark age. Then we can even talk about another period that's called as early medieval, and this period is also called as dark age by them. So this is how this idea appears, and this idea was applied universally, and by applying this idea, a couple of phases of Indian history had been called as dark age. So this is how you see that the concept of dark age is coming. So the point is that how come the post-Mauryan period is called as dark age? That is something which you have to focus upon, right? The post-Mauryan period is termed as dark age. Now what parameters were there on basis of what ultimately any particular period is called as dark age? So listen a couple of ideas very carefully. Yes, decentralization. Now political decentralization remain decentralization remain one of the most important parameters for calling any period as dark age. Now, what is political decentralization? Once you are comparing the Mauryan period with the post-Mauryan period, I hope you can understand what is this political decentralization. In fact, when you talk about 18th century, and if you have some rough idea on 18th century, in that case, you all may realize one fact, that during the 18th century, instead of almighty Mughals, you can find so many regional powers were there, such as one hand you will find the Murshid Quli Khan is there, or Alivardi Khan is there. Then we can talk about Marathas, you can talk about Nizam, you can talk about the Nawab of our Sikhs are there, the Pathans are there, right? So that's how India was disintegrated into many smaller empires. And here that concept comes ki if any period which is politically decentralized, in that case this becomes one of the most important feature for what? The feature for the dark age. So political decentralization remains in the core of this decentralization, in the core of the dark age concept. And that was very much applicable to the post-Mauryan period also. Now, when you talk about the post-Mauryan period, I would like to just see one map, and this map is categorically conveying this idea that how come India was disintegrated into several empires, right? So this is the period, this is the place where the Sungas and Kanvas are there. Like here you can find the Indo-Greeks followed by Sakas or Saka-Parthians, then they were followed by Kusanas, then Saka-Chhatrapas are there, Satavahanas are there, Chola, Chera and Pandyas are there. And that's how you'll find that in India, there were several kingdoms came into existence, and unfortunately they could not repeat or they could not revise the same sort of glory which was being enjoyed by the Mauryans, and that was considered to be one important feature of decentralization. So the idea of dark age, the idea of dark age actually appears from the concept of political decentralization. But then this political decentralization was even applied to some other areas in order to somehow justify in a better way about this dark age, Now, what is this political, apart from this political decentralization, we can talk about some other thing. Now, it was imagined that whenever there is a political decentralization, that must be the reason for the declining economy. Now, this economy was mostly traced, or the declining economy was mostly traced with respect to what? The trade and commerce. Got the point? Trade and commerce remains the most important argument for it. Look, agriculture is something which is never going to decline, because agriculture is a sort of very micro practice, and that's the reason because of what there cannot be a sort of direct application of any greater change or any bigger change over agriculture, and that's why nobody talks a lot about this agriculture here. They mostly talk about trade and commerce. I hope you can understand that if you compare two situations, in one situation number one where there is a larger kingdom or a bigger empire, and that bigger empire is always in a condition to facilitate the trade and commerce, because the custom duties are being collected in lesser places. So suppose you talk about the Mauryan Empire, so okay, it can be collected once anything is coming from outside and entering into Mauryan Empire, and then the other sort of tax was levied only once it is being sold in the market. So there are two places where normally the taxes are being collected. But then you imagine if somebody is coming from the northwestern side, and suppose he is willing to sell his stuff in the Bengal region, in that case he needed to cross at least 3 to 4 kingdoms, and whenever he enters into any new kingdom, he was supposed to pay the taxes. So that's how it becomes one of the reasons for the declining trade and commerce, because now the profit margin is getting down, and that's how people do not prefer to have trade with them or trade with India, and probably this is the reason because of what trade and commerce is declining. Well, when it comes to declining economy, so trade and commerce is declining. Along with the decline of the trade and commerce, you can even find the decline of manufacturing, because these are these are directly proportionate, and that's the reason because of what they believe the craft industry or the manufacturing industry is also getting down. At the same time, they had been listing another reason because of what economy is declining, because now they are connecting it with the political decentralization. Look, if the Mauryans are controlling the whole India, in that case undoubtedly people won't be capable of challenging the Mauryan Empire, because it remains very powerful. But then in the other situation where you talk about decentralization, what possibility is there that since there were so many smaller kingdoms, and that's how they must be fighting continuously in order to expand their kingdom, and that's how we can say there was much war going on in this period. And in fact, you all should understand one point ki if this much frequent wars are there, in that case undoubtedly the economy must be going for what? They must be going for a sort of decline, correct? So basically we can talk about a sort of decline here, like even in the economy because of this political decentralization, and that's how they prove logically that there must be some sort of decline in economy, not some sort of, rather a sort of massive decline in the economy that can be noticed. Okay. The third aspect, okay, that is considered to be the society. Now, how come it is having an impact over the society? Normally, it is believed that society should have a sort of progressive tendency. The society should always go to the upper side. That is the basic assumption, and society should be progressive. But like it is assumed that basically in the any dark age, the society becomes non-progressive. Right, non-progressive. There is another word that had been used by those people who tried to prove it, like dark age. The society remains stagnant in this particular period. Now, what is the meaning of stagnancy? Now, this is a very core concept, and you have to be you have to understand this particular point very carefully. Stagnant society means less progressive society. And how do you find a progressive society? If a society is very mobile, in that case the society would be progressive, right? If the society is confined with various taboos, various restrictions are there, in that case you won't find that mobility. So look, I am talking about two different kind of mobility that you need to keep in mind. One mobility I am talking in terms of physical mobility, right? And the another terms, another mobility what I am trying to discuss here or trying to talk about here is basically the mobility inside the society. Let's say if you talk about a society which is restricted by several taboos, in that case the physical mobility would be less. In which society you find more physical mobility? Which is very much connected, which is well connected with the other lands through the trade and commerce. That is the most important reason for the physical mobility. But I have already proved that actually the trade and commerce is declining, and that's how the physical mobility is getting restricted. On the other hand, there is another term that you need to keep in mind, that's about the social mobility. Now, what is this social mobility? Social mobility is basically that mobility where you are having this freedom to upgrade yourself in the social order. Like if you compare the European society with the Indian society, in that case you may find one thing. The European society was having a feature that was called as the slavery, right? On the other hand, the Indian society was having another feature, and that was called as the Varna system. As far as the slavery is concerned, that is a class construction in the society, and by people by upgrading themselves, right, they could have come out of this status of the slaves. But then is it possible in the Varna system? No. And in fact, like the way I did tell you that gradually you can find more consolidation of Varna, and in fact in this particular period you find another social identity remains or becomes very important, that is caste. And in every social construct or the social institution, something which was very important, that was mobility. It was always restricted because no Varna, no text is saying, okay, you people are free to change your Varna. Have you read anywhere? No. Over the period, you can find that these kind of institutions were becoming more and more concrete. Probably when Varna system is coming into existence in the initial period, at that point of time, mobility was bit accepted, right? Let's talk about the Varna period, let's talk about the Rig Vedic period. In Rig Vedic period, openly I told you that this kind of mobility was practiced. But the moment you enter into the later Vedic period, you find that it became birth based, and the moment you travel further, you can find that it was becoming more and more birth based, and in fact the notion of purity got severely associated with this idea, and that's how you can say that even the social mobility was restricted. So whenever this kind of physical mobility and the social mobility is restricted, it is always conveying, or it is always bringing a sort of non-progressive society. आप क्यों प्रोग्रेस करेंगे? प्रोग्रेस करने के बाद भी क्या आपके पास कोई बहुत सारे स्कोप बचे हुए? Is there any great possibility for you to do something good? No. Let's say you upgraded yourself in the economic order. What happens? What is the result of that? Ultimately, there's no upgradation in the social order. You remain there only. So how much money you do have is not going to decide that whether you're going to get a proper status in the society or not. In that case, people won't be very conscious for द क्लास अपग्रेडेशन, राइट। अगर आपको पता है कि आपको सिविल सर्वेंट बनने के बाद भी सोसाइटी में कोई तवज्जो नहीं देगा या कोई इंपॉर्टेंस नहीं देगा, तो क्या आप ऐसे में करना चाहेंगे? नहीं करना चाहेंगे। ये तो कॉमन सी चीज़ है। तो लोग तो ऐसा अजम्पशन है कि लोग क्या करते हैं, लोग मानते हैं कि यार कोई फ़ायदा नहीं, जैसे है वैसे ही चलने दो चीज़ों को। फिजिकल मोबिलिटी जब रिस्ट्रिक्ट हो जाती है तो उससे क्या होता है कि द चांस और द पॉसिबिलिटी ऑफ लर्निंग न्यू आइडियाज इज ऑल्सो गेटिंग वैनिस्ड, ठीक है। आप नई जगह पे जा रहे हैं, यू आर लर्निंग न्यू थिंग्स, राइट, एंड देन यू आर ट्राइंग टू अप्लाई दीज आइडियाज इन योर सोसाइटी एंड दैट्स हाउ द सोसाइटी इज प्रोग्रेसिव, बट देन नीदर यू आर गोइंग टू a new place nor you are getting the new ideas, and that's how, like, whatsoever, like, technology you had been using, whatsoever progressive ideas you had, that's getting stagnant, and that's how the idea or the concept of non-progressive or the stagnant society comes in. So that's why in terms of society also some sort of devalue, like, you can find, and on the basis of these three important parameters it had been tried to prove actually what sort of period it was the period of dark age, correct. And the way you find the Malekcha and all these terms have been, like, very much used during this period, exactly. तो उसकी वजह से हम कहते हैं कि क्या हो रहा है यहाँ पे, ये exactly एक dark age है इंडियन हिस्ट्री का। Let's move to the counter arguments. Now the counter arguments are universal, correct. आप किसी भी एज को डार्क एज करें और आपको उसका काउंटर आर्गुमेंट देना, यूनिवर्सल है वो, ठीक है, सेम चीज़ें चलेंगी हर जगह। लेकिन यहाँ पे while giving the counter arguments we'll be picking up the examples from post-Mauryan period. Why? Because precisely we have been discussing about the post-Mauryan period here. Okay, first thing. Now the first important topic, whether decentralization is a good administrative system or a bad administrative system. बड़े मतलब आप अगर जो है मतलब it's not about local level and the बड़ा level. I'm telling you about these two approaches. What you are saying कि from the local level it seems to be good. मतलब आप यहाँ से देखेंगे तो आपको कैसा दिख रहा है? अच्छा दिख रहा है। आप कह रहे हैं कि आप यहाँ से देखेंगे तो आपको ख़राब दिखेगा। वहाँ से भी चीज़ें ठीक ही है, क्योंकि कोई भी सेंट्रल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन अल्टीमेटली दे आर विलिंग टू सिक्योर द welfare of the people, and you can secure more welfare of the people only once you are decentralizing the power. If you are keeping the things like much in your command, in that case like there won't be the progress, because आपको पता है कि if highly centralized state is there, that is going to become the highly bureaucratized state, और जो बहुत bureaucratized state होता है वो ultimately आपको भी पता है बहुत corrupt होगा और ऐसी सारी चीज़ें होंगी, तो बहुत अच्छा नहीं होता। वहीं आपने जहाँ decentralize किया power वो सबके लिए अच्छा है। It is all the difference of the approaches. अगर आप ऊपर से देख रहे हैं top down approach है, in that case you might have a different perception. If you have the bottoms up approach, ठीक है, और from the below approach, in that case you can understand it a better way. But mind you, decentralization is always a good administrative system, right? But then it is all the difference is lying in the approach itself. Now if you consider कि decentralization is bad, and that's how you come up with the concept of dark age, correct. But if you believe कि decentralization is actually a good administrative system, in that case the whole idea of this dark age is getting finished or is getting vanished. There is no concept of like another dark age. Isn't that correct? Okay, वो क्या कहते हैं, मूछें हो तो किसकी तरह हो, नथुलाल की तरह हो, वरना मूछें नहीं, मतलब जिसकी मूछें चार्ली चैपलिन की तरह हो उनके लिए तो जो है वो क्या कहते हैं, उसके लिए तो सुसाइड जो है जायज़ बनता है। ये कोई मूछ है? मूछ हो तो फिर नथुलाल की तरह, वरना ना। दैट इज नॉट द राइट वे ऑफ सीइंग इट, ठीक है। मतलब मूछे ना भी हो, मूछे अनिल कपूर की तरह हो तब भी चलेगी, मूछे अगर चार्ली चैपलिन की तरह हो तब भी चलेगी। अरे हर किसी के अपने फायदे है ना। तो बेसिकली क्या हो रहा है यहाँ पे, ये आइडिया, ये पूरा का पूरा कंसेप्ट ही गलत है कि डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन इज अ बैड एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव सिस्टम। But then you have to also think on this particular concept with this idea that when that 18th century and 19th century period was there, at that point of time centralization was considered to be a good feature. But the way you find the entry of democracy, so democracy is such a system which is more suitable in a decentralized system rather than in a very centralized system. अगर highly centralized है तो फिर democracy कैसा, और अगर डिसेंट्रलाइज है तभी तो सही डेमोक्रेसी है। तो हमने कहीं ना कहीं 19th सेंचुरी में या 20th सेंचुरी में जाके हमारे परसेप्शन से बदल गए कि नहीं भाई, एक तो वो होनी चाहिए, डेमोक्रेसी होनी चाहिए, यूनिवर्सल फ्रेंचाइज होना चाहिए, ठीक है. एंड ऑफ कोर्स लाइक इट शुड हैव अ डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन, देन ओनली द interest of any individual can be secured. That's how the idea of like democracy is there. So by 20th century that whole perception for the administration got drastically changed, and that's how all those scholars who had been like those who were die-hard supporters of the concept of centralization, now they themselves have started re-evaluating their idea, and they also accepted that any decentralization administration is also good. And in fact, why do you think that if they've got decentralization or any empire got disintegrated into many smaller empire, so you just assume that the smaller powers would not focus on the economic and social progresses and all? Do you really believe so? In fact, you should think it in this way, that a smaller power would be more concerned of these kind of things, because if like they are becoming economically sound, if they are becoming socially sound, that would add or that would somehow like legitimize that person, and that's they were very concerned about this. इसीलिए हर छोटा किंगडम जो है आप देखेंगे ज़्यादा प्रोग्रेस करता है अगर कोई अच्छा रूलर है तो, और अगर कोई अच्छा रूलर नहीं है तो फिर जाहिर सी बात है वो प्रोग्रेस नहीं करेगा. सो दैट्स अ डिफरेंट थिंग, राइट. तो यू हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड वन थिंग कि डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन इज एक्चुअली ए गुड सिस्टम. तो मतलब जो डार्क एज के फंडामेंटल्स में है उसी में प्रॉब्लम है, ठीक है. जो डार्क एज के फंडामेंटल में है उसी में प्रॉब्लम है. ऑफ कोर्स लाइक यू कैन नॉट से कि डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन है तो खराब है और सेंट्रलाइजेशन है तो अच्छा है. हमने वो कंसेप्ट ही हटा दिया और हमने बोला कि नहीं, डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन इज ए गुड सिस्टम, एंड दैट्स द रीजन बिकॉज ऑफ व्हाट देयर शुड नॉट बी एनी डार्क एज. खत्म. लेट्स फिनिश दैट. ओके. नाउ द सेकंड काउंटर आर्ग्यूमेंट. The second counter argument is about the economy. Now they imagine कि whenever there is a decentralization, economy is always getting down. Correct? Acha, one more thing. When you talk about the decentralization, you have seen multiple powers. You have seen Sungas, you have seen Kusanas, you have seen Satavahanas. Now do you really believe कि they were the weak powers by any chance? Rather they were just growing their powers gradually, and over the period they became superpower, and that's why by any chance we cannot say that they were least bothered about their subject, they were least bothered about the economic and the social development, they were least bothered about the cultural and like cultural developments also. You can't say like that. So in fact in the post-modern period itself, like we do have so many examples through which we can prove that actually this concept is wrong. Moving to the next one, economy. Now since you have studied the postmodern period, I hope like just now you had been giving this counter argument to me कि how come it's possible to say that there was an economic decline in the postmodern period. Rather what we have studied a sort of progress in the economy. I am never hesitant while saying this, that economy or during the second urbanization was in its best during which period? The postmodern period. Because the apex of second urbanization would be noticed in which period? The second in the postmodern period. Why? Because the way you have seen that the way the land route trade got flourished, the sea route trade got flourished, right? The discovery of monsoon got a broader change. Then apart from that you can talk about, let's say, the way the links got established with the Western empires, that was also boosting the trade. And in fact, Satavahanas and Kusanas are precisely remain the examples. For what? Like, they have recognized the significance of trade and commerce. And since they have recognized the significance of trade and commerce, and this is the reason because of what I can say, कि they try to focus a lot on what? Their development of trade and commerce. Like while discussing about the Satavahanas, what did I tell you? The Satavahanas are moving from the eastern side to the western side in order to monetize the trade which started from the coastal region. Like for Kusanas also I did tell you, the Kusanas, like the center of the Kusanas was somewhere in the upper part of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Now they have shifted from there to the lower areas in order to only monetize this trade or keep their control over this trade which had shifted to the sea route now. Right. So this is how you understand this point, that they were giving due importance to the economy and specifically the trade and commerce, because the international trade remained the major source of their income, and that's how these people were like having a very different approach towards the economy. So by any chance we cannot say that there was an economic decline. In fact, when you talk about numerous wars undoubtedly, let's say, creating problems for the development of economy, but then wars are somehow promoting also the development of economy. People are getting employment, they are employed in army. Apart from that, the industries which are related to basically those things which are being created for the wars. Now they are in more need, or they are in more requirement during such kind of period, and that's how it cannot be taken in this way. This is the argument of a very famous scholar called Seema Alavi. Now she is giving this argument for 18th century, but then I am applying this idea here as well. So you can't see in this way ki whenever there are smaller kingdoms, like the numerous war are going to create so many problems. That's not correct. In fact, you have seen the rivalry between the Saka Chhatrapas and the Satavahanas in order to control this trade. So it was somehow giving a boost to the economy, and if your trade and commerce is very much flourished, I think it's quite logical that your craft and the manufacturing industry would also perform good, right? So that's how, like by any chance you cannot say it was declining, rather the economy was in its best during the post-modern period. Okay, fine. Third, now it is about the society. I think one counter argument I have already given, and what is that? I told you that you have just imagined that there is no physical mobility. Now, do you accept that there is no physical mobility? If the trade and commerce was performing exceptionally well, in that case, can you can you accept this argument that it was in decline? No, of course not. There is great physical mobility, and in fact, you can find multiple kind of migrations. If your crafts are doing good, in that case, you must say if this is the city, in that case you can find that multiple people are migrating to the cities from the rural areas or from the countryside, because anybody who found them as very relevant, or they found that their skill in the craft is very good and they'll be capable of selling their products even in the cities, they'll migrate to the cities, right? So that's a one mobility from cities to the other areas. That sort of migration is also there for trade and commerce. So first of all, I am saying that there was no physical mobility restricted. Rather, I'll prefer to say that there was great physical mobility in this period. Now moving to the next thing, social mobility, right? Whether this was in a practice or not. Let's say if I'll be asking this question to you, आपको क्या लगता है कि यहाँ पे social mobility है या पूरी तरीके से restricted है? थोड़ा रहा होगा या ज़्यादा रहा होगा? लोगों ने imagine किया कि since this is the period for what? The post-modern period. Post-modern period was the period for Brahminical revivalism, और इस बेसिस पे लोगों ने इमेजिन किया कि सोशल मोबिलिटी क्या है यहाँ पे रिस्ट्रिक्टेड है ना, क्योंकि ब्राह्मणिज्म तो कभी नहीं चाहेगा कि लोग सोसाइटी पीपल आर गोइंग फॉर द सोशल मोबिलिटी एंड दे मस्ट बी ट्राइंग टू रिस्ट्रिक्ट इट. बट देन फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, like I have already rejected this argument. I hope you remember. We have rejected that yes, Brahminical revivalism is there, but this Brahminical revivalism is not so dominant that they had been restricting the developments of society. No, it's not like that. Buddhism is also flourishing, Jainism is also flourishing, right? So every, let's say, sect or other religions were flourishing, and that's why you cannot consider this particular period only as a period for the Brahminical revivalism. So we have discarded all these ideas, okay? Now come to this point. We have multiple examples, right? Multiple examples where we can talk about the social mobility being practiced very frequently. Satavahanas tribals थे and they got the status of Brahmachhatra, correct? Sungas probably Brahmins थे, they are getting the status of Kshatriyas. And most importantly, the outsiders coming to India, they were being called as Malekchas, and from Malekchas, lower Kshatriyas, and finally proper Kshatriyas. What is this example of social mobility? The way you have seen that people are migrating from the countrysides to the cities, now that is again the example of social mobility, because once the people are coming to the cities, now they are free to get a new identity, and in fact it happened. Until and unless there is a proper record that okay, this particular caste is falling in the Sudra category, people are always having this possibility to upgrade themselves in the caste order. So that's how you can find that several examples of the social mobility. Now can you say that the social mobility was restricted during this period? No, rather we have the best examples of the social mobility in this period only, and that's how we can totally reject this idea by any chance there was a restriction of social mobility. That's how you can give the counter arguments, right? So when it comes to the post-Mauryan period, so there is one debate which is related to the dark age concept, and I have given you the arguments in support and then counter arguments as well. So if any question is coming, undoubtedly you are going to reject the ideas of questions they have already asked the question on, right? Yeah, exactly. But then, yes, when it comes to the counter arguments for this dark age, that's a late phenomena. Achha, sorry. I have just missed something. I use one term, non-progressive society. Okay? Now, can you literally imagine a society which is non-progressive? Have you ever seen the society going backward? Normally it doesn't happen. अच्छा, सोसाइटी की प्रोग्रेस हम इन टर्म्स ऑफ वैल्यूज़ नहीं देख रहे हैं, वैल्यूज़ शायद हमेशा डिक्लाइन करते होंगे, ठीक है, जो शायद मैं भी उससे कन्विंस हूँ कि वैल्यूज़ डिक्लाइन करते हैं. बट इन टर्म्स ऑफ मटेरियल प्रोग्रेस, इफ आई आस्क यू टू एग्जामिन दैट वेदर सोसाइटी इज गोइंग गोइंग बैकवर्ड, इज इट एक्सेप्टेबल? सोसाइटी यूजुअली बैकवर्ड नहीं जा सकती है अनटिल अनलेस कोई ऐसी क्रांति हो जाए, तब उसका हम नहीं कह सकते. बट क्रांति भी हमेशा सोसाइटी को क्या करती है, आगे लेके जाती है, पीछे कभी नहीं करती. सो नॉन प्रोग्रेसिव आइडिया जो है सोसाइटी के लिए वो बिल्कुल बेमानी है. इट्स प्रैक्टिकली नॉट पॉसिबल. लाइक एट एनी पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम यू कैन नॉट टॉक अबाउट ए नॉन प्रोग्रेसिव सोसाइटी. सोसाइटी इज ऑलवेज मूविंग फॉरवर्ड. द पेस ऑफ चेंज इज मे बी स्लो, may be fast. That's a different phenomena. But then society is never stagnant. Society is always progressing. That is the reality of the society. And that's how we can discard all these ideas that we have discussed, right? So this is how we have discarded the idea of dark age. But then we have to discuss something else, right? And what is that? Like we have to basically started this concept ki how come the concept of the golden age is coming. Golden age for whom? For which period? For the Gupta age. So Gupta age is being called as golden age, correct? The whole idea of golden age is the result of dark age only. ठीक है? Gupta age is being called as golden age. Why? Because the post Gupta period was called as dark age, correct? And since the counter arguments appeared pretty late, like from which particular period you can say the counter arguments were there? I must say 1980s, right? 1980s, and even I can say 90s. Like this is the period when the counter arguments were coming. The counter arguments were not there earlier. So they are the late phenomena, counter arguments. नहीं, dark age का counter. So what I can say कि till 1980s and 90s, majority of scholars kept on believing in the concept of dark age, correct? And that's the reason because of what, till 80s and 90s the concept of golden age was also there. ठीक है, क्यों? क्योंकि इसको डार्क एज को काउंटर करना है. बट डार्क एज को एग्जैक्टली काउंटर करने की बजाय ये लोग क्या कर रहे हैं, ये लोग एक दूसरे पीरियड को गोल्डन एज बता रहे हैं. कह रहे हैं कि आपने जो है मेरे जो है एक पीरियड को डार्क एज कहा, तो मैंने एक पीरियड को कहा कि मेरा वो गोल्डन एज है. आपने कहा कि यार तुम्हारा एक भाई बहुत बेकार है, वो कुछ करता नहीं है, तो मैं बोलूँगा उसको क्यों देख रहे हो, दूसरे भाई को देखो, IITN है, फिर IIM किया, फिर IAS किया, देखो उसको देखो. तो हमने इस पीरियड को जानबूझ के गोल्डन एज कहा. ठीक है. सो सबसे पहली चीज़ जो आपको समझनी है, दिस इज बेसिकली वॉट, दिस इज ए हिस्टोरिकल बायस. ठीक है. इट्स नॉट समथिंग ए सॉर्ट ऑफ रियल फिनोमेना, रादर आई कैन से दिस इज हिस्टोरिकल बायस. So again, we have been writing any answer, you should start your answer with this concept of historical bias. कि भाई ये कंसेप्ट ही हिस्टोरिकल बायस का है. ये कंसेप्ट कोई वैसा नहीं है कि जो ये कंसेप्ट ओरिजिनली एग्जिस्ट करता है, सच में कोई पीरियड गोल्डन एज होती है और सच में कोई पीरियड डार्क एज होती है. गलत है, ऐसा नहीं कह सकते. ये हिस्टोरिकल बायस है. एंड दिस कंसेप्ट ऑफ और दिस हिस्टोरिकल बायस continued till which period? This continued till 1960s, I must say. Like people kept on giving the logic of calling this Gupta period as what? Golden period. So ये पूरी कहानी ही historians के debate के पीछे है. ठीक है. ये कोई original कहानी नहीं. It's not a sort of natural story because of what we are bound to call it golden age. Correct? So this is how the concept of golden age is coming. So it's a historical debate. ठीक. So basically, as I told you that when it is being called as golden age, it is nothing but a sort of what? Historical glorification, right? It is nothing but a sort of historical glorification, and that was done by the old nationalist scholars. They are very old nationalist scholars, जैसे KP जायसवाल टाइप के लोग हैं ये लोग, या फिर मजुमदार टाइप के लोग हैं, RC मजुमदार, और ये लोग इसको कहते हैं कि ये गोल्डन एज है. ठीक है, आप इसमें लाइक यू कैन कीप KP जायसवाल, then RC Majumdar as well, RC Majumdar. These are the scholars that had been calling it golden age, right? Now, on what arguments they have called it golden age? So, what are the arguments in support? Arguments, right? So, first argument that they have been giving, it's about the political centralization. Correct? I think it's very simple to understand. It's political centralization. So political centralization क्यों? क्योंकि वो कहते हैं post Mauryan decentralized था, and again the Gupta period is becoming politically what? It's politically centralized. Correct? This is the Gupta empire. Okay, fine. Like all the parts are not included. Vakatakas are there. These are like yet not settled basically, and then some others were there. But then yet the Guptas had been ruling on a larger territory, and that's why they say the political centralization is coming back, and that's how it could not be called as golden age. Okay, fine. The second important argument is about the economic development. Economic development. Correct? Now, in the economic development, the most solid argument what they had been giving is about the gold coins, that too in larger number. During this particular period, you do find good number of gold coins issued by the Guptas, and in fact, you all know that Guptas are known for their golden coins. They were aesthetically most beautiful coins ever minted in India, and this is the reason because of what it's called as like the golden age even for the economy also. So the presence of gold coins had been interpreted in this way that there was great economic prosperity which was there. There must be very flourished trade and commerce, and in fact majority of the people were enjoying a sort of prosperity, and that's how these many gold coins are present, and they try to prove that yes, it was the golden age of Indian history. Okay, fine. During this particular period, like there was great amount of agricultural expansion that had been also used by them as a solid point in order to prove that there was a sort of like there was a sort of increase, or there was a sort of like prosperity was there even in the rural society, and that's how they do accept this idea that it was like true for this also, right? Okay, on the other hand, they believe that since it is a very ideal society which is present in India during the Gupta period, and that's how it is a golden age. Okay? Ideal in what sense? Because now everything is, or for everything, the rules were being drafted for society, for like inheritance, and for everything, and that's how they were trying to prove that it is considered to be the golden age. So these are the various arguments which were put forward by all these scholars that just now I have mentioned, and that's how it's being called as golden age of Indian history. Correct? And as I did tell you that these ideas continued till 1960s and 70s, but then like it is being challenged by some of the scholars, and they primarily include the Marxist scholars. Since the Marxist people have a different sort of like approach to see the society, and that's how they were not convinced with this idea, and the way they are shifting the approach of history from the political dimensions to basically the socio-economic dimension, and that's how they have started seeing into the Gupta age in a very different way. There are a couple of like very important scholars, okay? Among them we can say B.N. Datta is one of the early Marxist scholars. Then the most prominent one is D.D. Kosambi, and further 1965 onwards, the champion of the Marxist historiography, R.S. Sarma. Now these three have viewed the same period in a very different way, right? So you all know that what remains in the center of their argument, that is nothing but feudalism, right? In the center of their argument, it's the feudalism, and that's why they changed, they had started viewing it in a very different way. Now, how come that idea of feudalism is changing the older perspective? Because now they are saying that if you see the political decentralization, they refuted political centralization was rejected by them. And why it's rejected by them? Because they say that if feudalism is there, so feudalism is simply indicating towards what? Decentralization. So it's not the period for the centralization. They are saying it is the period for the decentralization, right? The next thing they have been putting, like the argument they have been putting forward, that how come you can say the economy was progressing? Rather, they tried to prove that economy was basically declining during this period. How come? Again, they have been linking this concept with what? They have been linking this concept basically with the concept of feudalism. Feudalism. Yes, I'll be coming to that point also. But first understand feudalism. Now, feudalism is whether feudalism is indicating towards an agrarian economy or the trade and commerce and the manufacturing. Agrarian economy. The moment you say feudalism, it is always a system which is present in the agrarian economy. It is never there in the urban economy. It's a phenomena, it's a feature of rural economy. Agriculture में ही apply कर सकते हैं because feudalism is a land-based system. And since it is a land-based system, and that's the reason because of what we can say, that the feudalism is ultimately indicating towards the decline of economy. Then they are putting forward another idea, and they are saying that even the coins, what we find in this period, now the coins are also having or indicating towards a declining economy. How come the coins are indicating towards a declining economy? Because they find that only the gold coins are present. That's one thing. And the second thing, they do talk about the debasement of currency. So if only gold coins are present, that is never indicating towards a positive economy or flourished economy. Because any economy which is flourished, right, that is flourished, or that may be flourished only once you have the coins of multiple values, right? The coins of many values. Gold coins, silver coins, bronze coins, copper coins, then some other coins, what we have seen in the post-modern period. But unfortunately, during this Gupta period, you can find majority of the gold coins are there. So it is clearly conveyed by them that presence of only the gold currency is clearly indicating that the economy was not very, very lively. It's not very much mobile during this period. Rather, they are saying that why this much gold currency? Now that's also being connected with the feudalism. They are saying that actually the gold which is present, that was used for another purpose. That was used for basically reserving their money, right? Keeping their money in the reserve format. That's why the gold is there. And in market there was no much sort of circulation of the gold coins, because it is impossible to have only gold coins in market, because the market won't run properly, and that's why they are saying it is the result of feudalism. And then it comes to debasement. When it comes to debasement, now you have to think in this way, that debasement is clearly indicating that the acceptance for the Gupta coins in other markets, outside markets, must have declined, because if your coins are really debased, in that case the coins would be losing their validity in the other market, and that's how they must not be used in the international trade. That's what they had been proving. So this is how I can say that the idea had been put forward by them, and this idea is basically showing that actually this period was not the gold age. Absent है, बहुत कम है बहुत कम है, ठीक है. And finally, it comes to the idea of society. Now, Marxist scholars are never convinced with a sort of very developed society in this period. Rather, they are saying that the way you see that the construction of caste is coming, Now the caste is not showing a sort of very glamorized right in a society, very progressive society, and that's how they change this approach also. And this is how the idea of calling the Gupta age as the golden age came or was questioned for the first time from 1960 onwards. This is the whole debate regarding this, golden age. So they have presented a very counter sort of argument, and for the first time the concept of golden age was questioned, and then we can say it remained, again that debate is there. But in the recent historiography, in last 2-3 decades, instead of accepting the Marxist challenge, we have given some new arguments in order to prove that yet the Gupta age must be called as a golden age for what? The golden age for art and culture. Golden age for art and culture. Okay. Now, what are the points? अभी हम बहुत extensively नहीं जाएंगे. I'm just giving you the points. So the first point is about the architecture. Now you all know that the temple architecture became prominent during this period only. So when you talk about the Nagara temple architecture, that flourished under the patronage of Guptas, and then you see the multiple varieties within this, and that's how in terms of architecture we reject that idea of the Marxist idea. Moving to the second thing, even in the field of sculpture you find immense development. Third, Sanskrit as a language flourished a lot, and in fact the Sanskrit as a language also flourished, right? And Sanskrit as the literature, Sanskrit literature, majority of the great scholar of Sanskrit you can notice in the Gupta period. Either you talk about Kalidas or Bhas or Sudrak, majority of the great scholars of Sanskrit could be noticed in the Gupta period. So Sanskrit as a language became very flourished, right? पहली बार ये लैंग्वेज इंडिया में स्टैब्लिश होती है जहाँ पे लोग they have started creating much literary works in Sanskrit, and as I told you that so many literary works are present, and then Sanskrit became one of the languages which was now being used by the people, and that's how we can say Sanskrit remains another important thing. Okay, fine. Next we can say this is one period where you can find that science and technology also improves a lot. Either you talk about the mathematics, in fact the mathematicians Aryabhat, the mathematicians or the scientists like Baramihir, all these great scientists could be noticed in this period, and majority of the achievements in India with respect to science could be noticed in the Gupta period, right? कुछ आर्किटेक्ट्स भी है जैसे बेताल भट्ट है, शंकु है, ठीक है, ऐसे बहुत सारे हैं, ठीक है, और ये सब दिखते हैं. ऑन द अदर हैंड व्हेन इट कम्स टू लैंग्वेज यू मस्ट बी रिमेंबरिंग अमर कोश विच इज रिटन बाय अमर सिंह, दैट वाज द फर्स्ट एवर संस्कृत डिक्शनरी. सो दैट्स हाउ यू कैन फाइंड डेवलपमेंट इन ऑल दीज लाइन्स. And then apart from this, yes, we can even talk about the development in the field of in the field of music and dance, Now this is another area, क्योंकि I hope you remember that popular text called as Natya Shastra, written by Bharat Muni, is creation of this period only, and that is how in India there is a proper dance form evolved, or the music forms evolved, which were considered precisely as Indian dance forms, right? And that's how we reached the concept of the classical also, because now Indian culture is getting a proper definition. Either you talk about language and literature, there is a there is a standard being set, right? When you say Indian culture, so Indian culture में language की अगर एक जो है या literature की एक अपनी identity है, वो पैरामीटर, वो स्टैंडर्ड कब सेट हो रहा है? इसी पीरियड में, ठीक है. कालिदास, आपको भी पता है कि कालिदास इज नॉट बीइंग कंपेयर्ड विद एनी नॉवेलिस्ट, राइट, और एनी ड्रामेटिस्ट. कालिदास इज नॉट बीइंग कंपेयर्ड विद एनीवन, रादर कालिदास इज सेटिंग द हाईएस्ट लेवल ऑफ द लिटरेरी क्रिएशन, राइट. And the same way when it comes to the the music and dance. So when exactly the Indian music is being defined, which can be considered as the Indian music or the Indian dance, that's again happening in the Gupta age. So how come that idea of classical is coming? That idea of classical is coming because of this, because either you say about the architecture, you say sculpture making, you say language and literature, you say science and technology, you even say music and dance. Everywhere the standards were being set, and these standards were the reasons because of what? It was even being termed as the classical age of Indian history, classical age of Indian history, and at the same time it's being called as the golden age of Indian history, correct? So if any debate is coming with respect to the golden age, you'll be writing three sort of debates. First, some arguments in favor, then the Marxist criticism, and then again arguments in favor, and that's how we'll be proving yes, it could be called as the golden age, not in terms of, sorry? These are the revisionist scholars, the recent day scholars. All these recent day scholars, either you say Romila Thapar, then Ranavir Chakravarti, they all are convinced with this idea. Okay? So this is how this concept is appeared. And then, as I have discussed, there is another concept is there with the Gupta age, that's the classical age. So again, you can write here that there were several standards for being for several things, like or several art forms are being set up in this period, and that's how the concept of classical also appears here. That's the whole discussion related to the golden age and the classical age as well as dark age, right? So I think this part is clear to all of you, right? Correct? Okay, fine.